$82 million. Penn Central lost it in a single quarter, while still writing dividend checks to its shareholders. On June 21, 1970, the Penn Central Transportation Company filed for bankruptcy. It was the largest corporate collapse in American history. Nothing had come close. Not a railroad, not a bank, not a manufacturer. A company that moved the freight and passengers of the northeastern United States. A company born from a merger that Wall Street called the deal of the century. It simply stopped, and it took the entire commercial paper market down with it. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to February 1, 1968. That is the day the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central Railroad merged. These were not small companies. The Pennsylvania Railroad had been called the standard railroad of the world. The New York Central had the most famous passenger route in America, the 20th Century Limited, New York to Chicago, overnight in 16 hours. Together they became Penn Central, the largest railroad in the United States, the sixth largest corporation in the country. It should have been a triumph. But here is what Wall Street missed. These two railroads hated each other. Their employees hated each other. Their computer systems couldn't talk to each other. The Pennsylvania used one operating method. The New York Central used another. When you merged them, locomotives from one railroad refused to run on the other's maintenance schedule. Freight cars sat in the wrong yards. Shipments vanished. Trains ran late. Customers left. The Pennsylvania had been a tightly managed, conservative institution. The New York Central had been looser, more aggressive. When their management teams collided, the result was paralysis. Decisions that should have taken days took months. Nobody agreed on who was in charge of what. The railroad that was supposed to dominate American transportation couldn't reliably move a boxcar from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, and it was losing money from the first day of the merger. Not a little money. Staggering amounts. The railroad lost more than $100 million in 1969. It lost another $82 million in the first quarter of 1970 alone. But here is the part that should stop you cold. While it was losing that $82 million, Penn Central's board was still paying dividends. They were handing money to shareholders with one hand, while the company bled out through the other. Why would they do that? Because Penn Central needed access to the commercial paper market. Commercial paper is short-term debt, 30 to 90 days, that large corporations use the way you use a credit card for a month before the bill comes. If you look like you're in trouble, investors stop buying your commercial paper, and you lose your source of operating cash overnight. So Penn Central kept paying dividends to signal that everything was fine. It was a performance, a very expensive, very temporary performance. By the spring of 1970, the performance was failing. Word was getting out. Sophisticated investors were declining to roll over their commercial paper. Pension funds were pulling back. The company needed $200 million to continue operations. Its executives went to Washington. They asked the Nixon administration for a federal loan guarantee. The Defense Department allegedly considered it briefly on the grounds that the railroad was essential to national security. Congress wasn't moved. The loan guarantee was denied. On June 19, 1970, Penn Central's board met and acknowledged the reality. 2 days later, on June 21, the filing went in. Bankruptcy, the largest in American history. 94 subsidiaries went down with it. Tens of thousands of employees reported to work that morning, not knowing if they would be paid. What happened next was a genuine financial emergency. Penn Central had $270 million in commercial paper outstanding. That paper was now worthless. It was held by banks, by money market funds, by corporations that had parked cash there because it was supposed to be safe. These were not investors who had taken a risk. They had bought short-term paper from one of the biggest corporations in America. And now it was gone. The Federal Reserve moved immediately. It opened the discount window and made it easier for banks to borrow, because the fear was that the commercial paper freeze would spread. If investors decided that no large corporation's short-term debt was safe, the entire market would seize. Companies across America used commercial paper to fund payroll, to buy inventory, to keep the lights on. A nationwide credit freeze in June 1970 wasn't a hypothetical. It was a real possibility. The Fed's intervention stabilized the situation, but the scar remained. The commercial paper market never fully recovered its pre-Penn Central innocence. The railroad itself kept running, because it had to. Stopping Penn Central wasn't an option. It moved too much freight, too many commuters in the Northeast Corridor. Federal courts appointed trustees to manage it. The government kept it alive on emergency funding for 6 years. By 1976, Congress had seen enough. It passed the Railroad Revitalization and Regulatory Reform Act and created Conrail, a government-owned corporation that absorbed Penn Central and 6 other bankrupt northeastern railroads. The passenger routes had already been handed off. In 1971, Amtrak was created specifically to take the intercity passenger burden off railroads that couldn't afford to run it. Penn Central's famous passenger routes became Amtrak routes. The Northeast Corridor, the spine of American rail travel, is still run by Amtrak today because Penn Central couldn't survive running it. Conrail operated for 21 years before it was profitable enough to be sold back to the private sector. CSX and Norfolk Southern bought it in 1999. The final price was $10.2 billion. The railroad that Penn Central had destroyed took 3 decades, an enormous public investment to rebuild. The shareholders got almost nothing. The commercial paper holders took devastating losses. The pensioners of both original railroads spent years in litigation over benefits. A company that employed 100,000 people, that moved freight and passengers across the most economically productive corridor in the world, that was called the greatest merger in American railroad history, was gone in 2 years. The forensic question, the one worth sitting with, isn't how Penn Central collapsed. It is how it survived as long as it did. The merger was functionally broken on day 1. The operating losses were visible in the quarterly numbers for anyone who chose to look. The dividend payments in the face of those losses were a signal, not of strength, but of desperation. The executives knew. Some of the sophisticated investors knew. But the commercial paper buyers, the ones holding $270 million of 30-day debt, didn't know, or they chose not to ask. That is how money dies in a large institution, not in a single dramatic moment, in a series of decisions where every person involved had a reason to look the other way for one more quarter. The Pennsylvania and the New York Central merged because it looked like strength. The dividend kept being paid because it looked like confidence. The commercial paper kept being sold because Penn Central had always been good for it. Every signal was a lie, and every lie was believed because believing it was easier than asking the question that would end the game. $82 million in 90 days, and they were still signing the dividend checks.